All right. So let's see if this works. All right. So we've got literary terms review here for quarter 3. So a lot of this is stuff that we did first quarter and second quarter, but some of it are terms specifically from this quarter. But we got to review them all because all of these terms could be on the assessment. And the assessment's going to be 10 questions, just like some of the other ones you've taken, and pretty straightforward. When you look at it, I'll give you a myth you've never read before, or at least not in my class. And you'll read the myth, and then I'll ask you questions like, what kind of narrator does it have? Or identify the initiating event, or give me an example of metaphor, or is the protagonist a static or dynamic character and why? Or show me an example of illusion, or is there an example of divine intervention, or what part of this journey is the meeting the mentor, right? Like, so these are all the kinds of questions I can ask. And you should have the knowledge to successfully answer them. But it will be open note. Any notes you take right now, you're welcome to use when you take the assessment. So, and if you have any questions as I go through, like I say, just drop them in the chat, or you guys raise your hand or just call out and I will answer. Normally when I'm lecturing, I'm looking at the class. Here I am looking at the board. It's weird, but we'll make it happen. All right, so we start out with looking at the narrator. Remember that narrator has different names depending on who your teacher is. I like to call them just the narrator, but some teachers call it narrative perspective or point of view, or they take point of view and call it POV. All of those things mean the same thing, essentially. There's a set of binaries, limited versus omniscient, past versus present, reliable versus unreliable, and then there's the various persons. So a limited narrator knows only what the character knows. Those of you who are reading The Hunger Games, we have a very limited narrator, limited to the understanding of Katniss Everdeen. Those of you who are reading The Hobbit, you have a very omniscient narrator, a narrator who knows everything that could happen or is going to happen and what all the characters think and can change between characters whenever they want to. That would be an omniscient narrator. This is the traditional voice of the storyteller. So most things that come from oral tradition are going to have an omniscient narrator. Then we have first, second, and third person. First person is when the narrator uses I. You're looking out of the character's eyes. Again, Katniss Everdeen is a first person narrator in The Hunger Games. I think that there are some little first person sections in Ender's Game at the beginning of each chapter when Colonel Graff is talking with various people. But most of Ender's Game is written in third person, and Treasure Island and The Hobbit are both written in third person. Rarely do you see second person. Usually it's instruction manuals or RPG games online when they're talking to you as a character. You do this, you do that. It's not something you see in literature very much. I do want to remind you all, as you continue to write academically, it is expected that you stay in the third person. He or she, none of this I or you or we or us. That's all too informal. That's like you're writing a personal note to somebody as opposed to an academic paper. Any questions on that? I guess we're not quite done with narrator. Then we have the tense of the narration. Is it in the past tense or is it in the present tense? Most narrations in the past tense. Voice of the storyteller, again, is omniscient. It's third person and it's past tense. It's already happened. The storyteller is telling something that has occurred in the past. You can look at the verbs and they'll tell you the tense. Verbs that end with ed, showing that things have already happened, tell you it's a past tense. Whereas in the present tense, things are happening. So a past tense verb would be like ran. A present tense verb would be runs. A lot of times it has an S. So present tense is Katniss Everdeen, past tense is the other three. Reliable versus unreliable. I think all of our narrators in the books that you're reading are reliable narrators. They're telling you the truth. They're not trying to trick you. But we did read The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, in which the narrator was crazy. And so we had an unreliable narrator there. I would also argue that the narrator in Animal Farm was unreliable because he told us everything from the animals' point of view, and the animals were stupid, right? And so they would tell you things and expect you to believe them when, in fact, you knew as a reader that they weren't true. And so you also had an unreliable narrator there, not because the narrator was trying to trick you, but the narrator was too stupid to understand what was happening, because it was told from the animal's perspective. So that's narrator, and we can do a lot of stuff with that. Then we got plot structure. This is review, but one thing to think about as I review plot structure with you is how well plot structure kind of fits also the hero's journey. There's like an interesting overlap between plot structure elements and hero's journey elements. For example, the initiating event and the call to adventure are almost always the same thing in a hero's journey story. But not all stories are hero's journey stories. Not all stories are heroic epics. So setting, remember the setting is a time and place in which a story occurs. If I'm giving you a Greek myth, the setting should be pretty easy to identify. Greece, ancient times, right? Like, you don't have to have an exact year. Exposition is an information dump at the beginning of the story. Most stories, especially older stories, start giving us a ton of information about the setting and the characters, and then they try and like sneak some of those themes in there and give you some idea of what you're doing. More modern stories sort of chunk that out, but even the Hunger Games, there's a lot of exposition. You got to learn about District 12. You got to learn about Katniss and her family, what happened to her dad. You got to learn about Gale. You got to learn about Panem, like all of these things. And same thing is true for Ender's Game. Obviously, the Hobbit info dumps on you in the first couple chapters pretty hardcore, and so does Treasure Island, because they're older books. The initiating event is the moment that starts the rising action and introduces the conflict of the story. You guys are all far enough along in your books that you should know what the initiating event is. In the Hunger Games, Prim gets selected for the Hunger Games, and Katniss has to volunteer as tribute. In Ender's Game, Ender is selected to go to battle school and gets on a spaceship and flies up to battle school. In The Hobbit, a bunch of dwarves show up on Bilbo's doorstep and have a party in his house and sign him up to be a thief in their adventure. And in Treasure Island, Jim Hawkins finds a treasure map in the old pirate's chest, right? And so all of these things are initiating events that sort of start the momentum of the story. Yeah, I think that's good enough. Rising, you could usually identify a theme, I'll just say, in the initiating event. If you look carefully, usually you don't know what the theme is when the initiating event happens, but as you get farther into the book and you look back on the initiating event and what's going on there, you can usually identify a theme. So if you're looking for a theme in any of your outside reading books, let's go back and take a quick look at that initiating event and see what sort of lessons come out of it. All right, rising action is everything between the initiating event and the climax. So, the initiating event is going to start this cycle of building action, and it's going to intensify and intensify and intensify and intensify until you hit the climax, which we call the high point in the action or the turning point. So sort of one of two things. And you can always argue anything in English class, by the way, or don't forget that, like, there's no right or wrong, right? There's well argued, badly argued, and I'm up for a good literary argument about what the climax is. But basically, if you can make the case that it's the high point in the action, the most intense moment in the story, or that it's the point of no return, at which point the story can't go any direction except for the direction that it does go in, then it's the climax. So like when Lenny snaps Curly's wife's neck and she flops like a fish in the barn floor or whatever, that's a turning point. There's no going back for Lenny. He is now a murderer, right? Like, so you can sort of see how, and it's also a high point in the action. That's the kind of thing, if you can identify that for the myth, you'll be good. Falling action is everything between the climax and the resolution. Things are going to sort of tie up the loose ends. We're going to know what happens to various characters, and we're going to get a sense of closure. And then the resolution is usually thematic and reinforces the lesson of the story. In a story, it's like the last paragraph. In a novel, it's usually the last chapter. And you just look at that. So the three sort of thematic areas are always the rising action, the initiating event, the climax, and the resolution. If you can identify those three things and look for commonalities between them, usually you can come up with the theme and the lessons that the author's trying to teach. And sometimes resolutions are satisfying, and sometimes resolutions are not satisfying. Like shooting Lenny in the head, not satisfying. Napoleon turning into a human and ruling the farm, not satisfying. Heroes' journey stories, though, tend to have satisfying resolutions. We tend to feel good about the hero, as you should note from the work that you did with the TV show. All right, so next we have figurative language. We've been working with figurative language, identifying it and looking at what the author's doing with it all year long. A lot of the simple review. Simile is a comparison using like or as. So, Control F and look for the word like or as, and you should be able to find a simile pretty easily. Metaphor is a little more difficult. It's a comparison not using like or as, and there's lots of different ways to do this. So many that I can't really, sit and give you a list. But anytime somebody's making something seem like something else and there's no like or as, we call it a metaphor. I'll put a star there for you. Don't forget that metaphor is a super useful term, because if you know something figurative is going on and you're not sure what, you can call it metaphorical, and you're usually pretty good. He's making a metaphorical statement here. That's sort of our way of saying he's not being literal. Figurative and literal are opposites. Personification, giving human traits to inanimate things. Hyperbole is just a fancy word for exaggeration. So go ahead and use the word exaggeration, but when you're writing, use the word hyperbole, especially if you're talking about a book and the author's doing it on purpose. Oxymoron, two contradictory words placed together for dramatic effect. Things like, I don't know, cold fire, or bitter sweet. Actually, we turned that one into a single word. But anytime you have two contradictory things smushed together and it's, just creating some kind of interesting effect, we call it an oxymoron. Paradox is a lot more complicated. It's an impossible or illogical statement that holds some figurative truth. We haven't seen a lot of these. We saw one like way back in 11. You guys remember that? Maybe. She said the balloon was blowing so far away that you have to close your eyes to see it. Like literally, if you close your eyes, you can't see anything. But figuratively, when something's so far away, you can't see it with the naked eye. You can close your eyes and sort of picture it out there. And it's the idea that sometimes things get so far away from you that the only place they exist is in your memory. And the way to best see those things is to close your eyes. And so it ends up being an impossible statement that doesn't have a lot of logic, but when you think about it on a figurative level, it's true. An example that I really like, I usually have it on the wall of my classroom, but obviously I haven't decorated this place at all, is a quote by Oscar Wilde. He famously said, there are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what you want, and the other is getting it. And you're like, wait, what? Because that means that everything in life is a tragedy, and that doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense, Oscar Wilde, but it's true. Not getting what you want is tragic. We all want to get what we want, and when you don't get it, you're upset. But whenever you get what you want, you get tired of it. And so when you want it, it can be perfect, and you can desire it, and that is good. But when you get it, it never is. And so you end up moving on to something else. This is especially true in, as I always say, video games and relationships. So moving on, apostrophe, talking directly to something that cannot respond to you. Obviously, we saw that in To a Mouse when the farmer ran over a mouse's house and talked to the mouse. But it's going to come back in poetry that we see later. There was also an apostrophe in Prometheus. You guys remember the Prometheus poem by Lord Byron we read in class? He was talking to Prometheus, and Prometheus isn't even like, it's a Greek titan, some mythological figure. So obviously not going to respond. So, and it's not as crazy as it sounds talking to something that can't respond. You do it to your alarm clock every morning when it goes off. You're like, shut up. Yeah, and then, like you talk to your alarm clock. Or, you talk to the TV during a sporting event when your team's doing well or when your team's doing badly, or your parents talk to somebody when they cut them off on 66. Like we use that all the time. It sounds weird to talk to something that can't respond, but it's pretty common. Then we have character terms that you need to know. I tried to put these in binaries because character terms are almost all binary. You need to know the difference between protagonist and antagonist. Remember, protagonist is the main character of a story. We use that term instead of hero because we have protagonists like Deadpool now, and you're like, that guy's not a hero. He is the main character, though. Protagonist. Antagonist is a character opposed to the main character of a story. Again, it's moral neutral, so you can use antagonist and not mean villain, because sometimes the antagonist is not a villain. When your protagonist is Anakin Skywalker and your antagonist is Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan's really the good guy, but he's the antagonist because he's not the main character. So protagonist, antagonist, make sure you get that separation figured out. Then we have direct and indirect characterization. Remember, the author will tell you things about a character, straight up tell you in their narration, or another character will tell you things about a character, and you don't have to think about them. You don't have to do any deducting. You don't have to do any detective work. That's direct characterization. Indirect characterization is what the author implies about a character through the character's appearance, actions, dialogue, etc. You have to do the detective work. You have to decide for yourself. So if, for example, we're, I don't know, doing the myth of Arachne, and you know, Athena comes down and she's like, I'm Athena, and Arachne's like, shut up, old hag. Right? Like you make some value judgments on Arachne because of how she's acting, and that would be indirect characterization. But when the narrator of the story says, Arachne was so disrespectful that, you know, that tells you that she's a disrespectful person. You don't have to think about it, right? Like that's direct characterization. So make sure you have those two things separated in your head. Then we got flat and round characters. A flat character is a two-dimensional character without a developed history, backstory, or motivation. Most characters are flat. Authors don't have time to develop every character. And so some characters come and go in a story and have no more meaningful contribution than, you know, moving the plot forward. A round character is a three-dimensional character with a clear history, backstory, and motivation. So the difference in the round character is we understand with nuance why they do what they do. And we can sit and we can think about what they would do in any number of situations because we have enough information about them to make these sorts of judgments. Flat characters, we just lack that information. They're like a cardboard cutout at the movie theater. They look three-dimensional when you look at them front on, but if you move to the side in any way, you find that they're this thin and there's no reality to them. So then we've got static and dynamic characters. Remember, a static character does not change in perspective, personality, or morality. We're talking about internal character changes, not physical external changes. So like I always say, if the character lost a limb, like they lose an arm, and they don't change their personality, it doesn't make them a dynamic character. If losing an arm makes them reassess their entire place in the world and change their ideology, then they're a dynamic character, because a dynamic character changes their perspective, personality, or morality over the course of a story. I'm trying to think of some good examples from the stories that we've read in class. I would say that George becomes a dynamic character at the very end when he decides to throw away all of his money and go get drunk. And he basically becomes like every other farmhand at the end of Mice and Men when he was different earlier. But I don't know that there's a lot of dynamic characters in Animal Farm. I think for the most part, they're kind of who they are from the beginning to the end. I guess you could argue that Napoleon changes, but we don't really have any evidence that he was different at the beginning. Sometimes, though, a flat character becomes a round character. You want to pay attention to that. It's usually thematic. If an author has a character that doesn't have a lot of development throughout the story, and then all of a sudden we learn more about that character, can place them and understand their background, there's something going on there. If we have a static character who becomes dynamic, there's something thematic going on there. You guys who are reading outside reading books, I say this very clearly. Every one of your protagonists is dynamic. The hero's journey is both a literal journey for the hero, going from point A to point B, and a metaphorical journey for the hero, where the hero makes some inner change. The journey is both literal and mental. And I think it's important that you understand that Bilbo Baggins is a dynamic character, and Katniss Everdeen is a dynamic character, and Ender Wiggin is a dynamic character. Look for the changes. Jim Hawkins, definitely a dynamic character. Probably he and Bilbo the most. Finally, stock character. It's a stereotypical character type. Generally, depending on when the story was written, there are stereotypes that work their way into the stories. If you become an author, you want to avoid stock characters. During the time in which a story is written, a stock character is entirely believable. But as a story ages, stock characters generally age badly. For example, if you watch any 1980s movie, right, the stock character is that every Asian dude is a secret ninja. Like, I swear to God, you watch an 80s movie and an Asian dude comes on, he's going to throw hands with somebody at some point. Like, that's literally how 80s movies go. And then you've got like these drug dealer gangsters that show up in like, I don't know how many 80s movies, and then you've got these weird like Colombian, you know, I guess paramilitary drug dealers, and like there are these weird stock characters that just show up and they date things. So if you can avoid them, avoid them. And I think for the most part, our authors have done that. Other literary terms, it's sort of a catch-all. Things that I expect you to know: foreshadowing, when the author hints at things that will happen later in the story. In other words, some big event is coming, and it's casting its shadow back into earlier parts of the book. And so you can oftentimes predict what's coming based on sort of the shadow of the future event. And that's why we call it foreshadowing. We're hinting at what's coming in the future. And there's a lot of that in all your outside reading books. You guys picking up on some of that? Hopefully you are. Symbolism is when something stands for something else. I had a lot of good literary analysis paragraphs about symbolism. The girl on fire in the Hunger Games, what fire might represent, and how Collins is using it. That's a great example. I had a good one on treasure in The Hobbit that was turned into me as well, and what treasure might symbolize in that one. Theme is a central idea or lesson of a story. We always talk about theme. One way to make any argument literary is to think about why the author wrote it and what lesson the author is trying to teach the reader. If I ask you on the assessment to write about a theme, though, please do not just throw a buzzword at me. Don't say, I don't know, say you're doing the Hunger Games. Don't say the theme is family. Like, what do you mean by family? What is Collins's lesson to the reader about family? Put it in to a lesson. So what is the author trying to teach the reader? Don't say the theme is family, or the theme is survival, or the theme is growth. I mean, these are just words. What is the lesson? Put it in words in a way that makes sense. We all still good? I've been talking a lot. How y'all doing online? Anybody have questions? You guys, anybody? I talk a lot. That's who I am. All right, we're getting close to the end here, though, I think. Allusion is a reference to an earlier and well-known story, event, person, place, myth. Allusions in a Greek myth will be to, you know, like the Greek gods, you know, or maybe to Hercules, or maybe to Theseus, or maybe to Arachne, or one of the other myths that we've read. There's not a ton of things that they can allude to because there's not a ton of written stuff that pre-exists Greek mythology. But in more modern texts, we have all kinds of allusions and references fairly frequently. And sometimes you get them and sometimes you don't. There's a lot of allusions to Beowulf in The Hobbit, and if you haven't read Beowulf, you're not going to see those. But there's a lot of allusions to Rome and some to Greek myth in The Hunger Games. And there's allusions hidden in Ender's Game to Norse mythology. Again, not everybody's going to get every allusion, but you should be able to identify one if I ask for one. Remember all your Greek myths. We did the mythology unit. You should be able to pick out a reference to those if it shows up. Rhetorical question is when a character or a narrator asks a question that either A, has no answer, or B, has an implied answer. So, you know, if you get to a point in the story and the narrator's like, what was so-and-so going to do? You know, like, that's a rhetorical question. There's no answer to that. You have to wait and see. It's designed to increase the tension. Or Squealer says, you know, do you want Jones to come back? And you're like, sorry about that voice, by the way, it was horrible. The implied answer is no, we don't want Jones to come back, right? So those would be good examples of rhetorical questions. Tone is the emotional quality of a piece of writing. And it expresses the speaker's attitude toward the subject. So basically, angry, sad, depressed, thoughtful. These are all words that can express the tone of something, and different characters tend to have different tones. You have characters that are sort of angry, and characters that are belligerent, and characters that are thoughtful. Um, a good example would be if you're reading Ender's Game, there's a clear difference in tone between, say, Valentine and Peter. They have different ideologies, they have different thought processes, and it comes across very clearly in the language that they've got. Poetic justice is when a character gets what he or she deserves, good or bad. Another word for this is karma. But when you're talking about it in terms of literature, we use the phrase poetic justice. Why do we call it poetic justice? Because we want it to happen in poetry. We want it to happen in our stories because it happens so rarely in real life, right? Like in real life, bad people who are born rich end up like having everything they want and never having to worry about anything in their lives. And, you know, good people that are born poor and work hard their entire lives sometimes can't pay their mortgage payment and their house gets foreclosed on. And there's no justice there. Good people get cancer, you know, like it's tough. As human beings, we got to deal with the reality of the world. And so when we read stories, we like it when characters get justice. They get what they deserve. The good guy gets rewarded, the bad guy gets killed or punished. But authors very carefully choose whether to give us poetic justice or not to help bring about the themes of their story. So look at characters and whether they get what they deserve or whether they don't get what they deserve. And when poetic justice is given or denied to a character, there's something thematic going on. And you, as a reader, should be able to identify what that theme is. So there's lots of ways into the theme, I guess, is my lesson here. And if you can identify them, then you can be a good writer of literary analysis. Onomatopoeia, when words are defined as the sound they make, like boom, bang, clash, tinkle. We saw this in, sorry, my mask is itchy today. We saw this in To a Mouse. Fable is a story involving talking animals with a clear moral lesson. I don't think any of our myths were fables, although, you know, Arachne did end up turning into a spider, so no, that's not a fable. Allegory is when a story has two or more levels of meaning, a surface level and a symbolic level. For example, Sisyphus. You guys remember Sisyphus with the boulder, pushing it up the hill and it rolling down? On the surface, it's just about a dude pushing a boulder up a hill, and then every time he gets to the top, the boulder rolls back down, and he has to push it up a hill again. On an allegorical level, that's your work day, every day of your life, right? So it's about all of us and our constant, repetitive, unending struggle to get up and go to work and be productive and then do it all again tomorrow. So it's an allegory. Comic relief is a funny moment in a tragic or dramatic work to release attention. There's been lots of these moments in your outside reading books. You know, things get pretty intense, and we've got to throw something amusing at the characters or at the reader just to have a laugh. So keep your eyes out for those. All right, now we're on to some epic and Greek terms. This stuff is really recent, so I won't spend as much time on it. Oral tradition is stories that come from a time before the written word and were passed down through the generations by word of mouth. All of our myths come from oral tradition. The Odyssey comes from oral tradition. Lots of ancient books come from oral tradition. Heroic epic is a long narrative poem. It's in three parts, this definition. It's got a narrator, and it's a long poem. It includes an epic hero and either a battle between good and evil or events of historical importance. The building of a nation, the destruction of a nation, those sorts of things. An epic hero is a person of high social status who has superhuman abilities. In the case of Odysseus, super intelligence. In the case of Achilles, he was dipped in the river Styx and is invulnerable to weapons and represents the values of his or her culture. Divine intervention is when the gods or God gets involved to aid a character, usually the protagonist or antagonist, often both. A quest is a long, dangerous journey designed to prove something about the hero. That's pretty vague, Mr. Howard, something, but different stories have different themes, and whatever the theme of your story is, that's going to be what your hero proves. A heroic epic is going to prove the heroism of the main character, their courage, their strength, their ingenuity, the heroic attributes that a character has. If you're reading a medieval story and it's a medieval romance, then it's going to prove the love the knight has for the lady that he's in love with. And so you're going to have a very different type of quest. Some quests are coming of age quests. where the hero is going to sort of grow up and take on the mantle of manhood. That's sort of the hero's journey that most of your characters are going through. In fact, I would argue that even Bilbo, who's like 50 when the story starts, is sort of a child in terms of his understanding of the world. He's lived in one town his entire life and never done anything. And so his is sort of a coming of age story as well. Hubris, that's the Greek word for excessive pride, generally the flaw of epic heroes. It's in a lot of myths. Icarus, Arachne may show up in the myth I ask you to read. Then we looked at the 3 different types of myths. I do expect you to know those 3 types of myths going into this assessment. We have the why things are the way they are myths. Why do we have spiders? Why do sounds echo? Why are there deserts? Why do we have seasons? Why do bad things happen to good people? Those are the why things are the way they are myths. We have the impossible journey myths. Hey, go kill Medusa. Hey, go defeat this Hydra, or bring me the golden fleece. And then we have the reinforced social rules or exposed social taboos myths. Don't, kill your dad or marry your mom. Don't eat people. Don't cheat death or try and get out of change your fate. It's not possible. These sorts of, be hospitable to others. All of these sorts of things are reinforced in myths. So try and identify when I give you a myth. There's definitely going to be a question on this. What type of myth we're dealing with here? Then we got the hero's journey. The myth that I give you is probably going to have a bit of a hero's journey in it. So I may ask you a question or two about that. Remember, there are 12 stages. We just did the classwork on it. Your character starts in the ordinary world. They get called to adventure. Some initiating event happens that makes them shake loose from the bonds of their ordinary world. They usually don't want to because they're comfortable in their world or they're afraid of change. But then they meet this person who helps them accept what's going on, and then they go into this sort of new world with new responsibilities. Usually, like I said, it's both a physical and a metaphorical journey. So crossing the threshold is going to be a physical step that they take that puts them in danger, but it's also going to be a mental step that they take to begin the process of changing who they are as a person, which is always painful and difficult to do. Then they are going to have trials and failures, allies and enemies. You'll meet the bad guys, you'll meet the friends, will try and succeed and try and fail. But over the course of all of this, they're going to learn new skills. Either they're going to learn what they need to improve on for a failure to an enemy and have to grow, or they'll learn it from an ally, or whatever. Then there's going to be that giant moment of self-doubt where they have some huge setback, either mentally or physically or both, that causes them to reassess, reevaluate, and almost quit. But then we have the big battle where either they die and are reborn literally, or their old self and their flaws die and they come back as a better person, like the old so-and-so is dead, long live the new so-and-so, metaphorically. They get rewarded for this change. Then they head back to their old life or make their new life into their, I guess, new life, their new normal, if you will. And then at the end, usually they return somehow back to normal, and everything sort of returns to normal, except for them. They're changed and their interaction with the world has changed forever. That was a long review. But it's done. Let me stop the recording so I don't have to bore other classes with more time.